Welcome to the Wayland Library, to the Great Presenter Series. I just have a couple of housekeeping things. This is going to be our last Great Presenters of this series because of the season. Because unfortunately our May speaker had to cancel. But we'll be starting up again in October, so watch the newsletter for that. Also, the library is embarking on a 5-year strategic planning process. So if you haven't already, we have a 13-question survey we would love your answers to. You can do it online, or we have a paper copy as well. So I'll have those back to back. So tonight we are privileged to have Joan Blair here to talk about the MFA's collection of Japanese woodblock prints. Joan is a docent at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She studied East Asian history as an undergraduate, but took a detour and spent 30 years in the computer industry. A particular interest was introducing computers to libraries. A trip to Japan reawakened her interest in that culture and in the surprising opportunity to use her knowledge of Japan and computers to catalog the Japanese woodblock prints collection at the MFA. So thank you all for coming, and please join me in welcoming Joan Blair.
Oh, thank you. This is so exciting. I'm going to turn this off. Thanks so much. It's always so much fun and to talk about what you really love and to share your knowledge. And so I appreciate everyone coming out on such a cold night. It's really, and there are some of my friends here from Florida. We all just got back. So thank you for coming. And thank you to both Steves, the Steve who's running the video and the Steve Engler for being on the committee and setting this up. I appreciate it very much. And Courtney, I certainly appreciate all the help that you've given me too. We were just talking about how much publicity now that we get with these great presenter series. So thanks to everybody and for coming. So we just heard some music in the background here. This young woman was playing the koto. Which is she was playing the shamisen, like the koto, but she was holding the shamisen, which is pictured quite a bit in woodblock prints. The topic of my talk, which someone already asked me if this is a talk I give at the museum. No, I don't. This is a talk I wrote specifically for this audience. We do different kinds of tours at the museum where we go all over the museum as docents. You've been on my tours. Yeah. And, but this particular presentation I did write myself, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to tell you that because I'm not representing the MFA. But I certainly have worked with the woodblock prints for a long time, and let me explain how that happened. The museum in the late 19th century got bundles of woodblock prints from a very adventurous and academic group of Bostonians. And they had never been fully cataloged or entered into the museum acquisition system. They literally sat in bundles. They called them bales. And 100 years later, they got a grant. They knew they always wanted to do this, but they got a grant to catalog these prints and to measure them, photograph them, digitize them, and actually find better ways of storing them. So they were looking for a team of volunteers to help with the cataloging process. And I was on a trip to Japan with the East Asian educator at the museum. And we were sitting in Tokyo looking at a castle. And we got to talking, you know, about who does what and what have you done. And she said, oh, have you been to Japan before? And I said, yes, I have. I've been to Japan twice before this trip. And she said, do you know something about computers? And I said, yeah, you know, I've worked in the computer industry at that time for 25 years. She said, do you know how to catalog? I said, yes, I do know how to catalog. She said, you have to come in. And really, the day we got back from Japan, she called me and said, I want you to come in right away. I want to tell you about this project because we need somebody who knows something about Japan, knows something about computers, and can catalog prints. So it was like amazing. Like they found me and I found them. And there were 30 of us on this project. And this was about 12 years ago. So it took us several years to catalog. The museum has about 50,000 Japanese woodblock prints. And it took quite a while to catalog them. But you'll see that one of the benefits of this is that they're now photographed and digitized. And you'll see later in the presentation, I'm going to be talking about one of the collections that you can now see on your computer. So let's go back to that in a minute. Some of you may have been there to the 2015 exhibit of Hokusai. It was really a fabulous exhibit. Hokusai is one of the most famous woodblock printmakers. And we had an enormous crowd come to this show, which is a testament to how popular these prints are. So a little bit about Japanese history to kind of get into the background of why these prints and the histories of these prints. The prints have been around for a while. Actually, the Chinese probably started woodblock printmaking maybe back in the 16th century. But they were never very fancy. They were mostly line drawings. So during the time of the Tokugawas, Japan was cut off from the rest of the world on purpose. There was no trade with any other country. There was no foreign alliances with Japan and other countries. They did not allow Christianity. They didn't want any missionaries. There was only one port in all of Japan where there could be trading, and that was in Nagasaki, and it was only the Chinese, the Korean, and the Dutch who had access to it. So there was no real vigorous trading going on during this whole period of the Tokugawa clan. And this is Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was one of the earliest of the clan. And he ruled as a military leader. And the daimyo reported to him more or less, but he relied on daimyo, who were feudal lords, property owners all through Japan, to be the local law enforcers. And that was the way the government ran. So Tokugawa had this issue that he had a lot of people in this island country and no contact with the outside world. So on purpose, it was required that every 2 years, the daimyo had to travel to Tokyo, at that time called Edo, that's the ancient name. They had to travel there with all this big, big retinue of servants and mostly single men, and they marched through the whole country from the various provinces where they had land, and they marched to Tokyo, and these marches became very, very elaborate with stanchions and parades, and maybe you've seen some of the woodblock prints with pictures of these things, and people would come out and watch them. And here's another one like this, and right here, you look at this guy, he pulled up his boat right there so we could watch this big parade. It was very formal. There could be music. It was very formal. Now, why they had these parades was so that the daimyo wouldn't be restless. And when the daimyo got to Tokyo, or sometimes Kyoto, into the towns, they needed something to do. There was nothing for them to do. So these districts grew up that just served the purpose of entertaining the daimyo. And here's a restaurant, just like this. Here's a restaurant. This may have been one of the places. Here's a kabuki theater, like this, very crowded kabuki theater. It was also, there were brothels, very definitely, a lot of young single men. And the reason, and oh yeah, here's a sumo wrestling match right here, so they needed a folder. But this is what the woodblock prints were used for. They were used to advertise the events in this particular area where the daimyo were congregating. And these events got to be so popular, and these districts within Tokyo and Kyoto became places that other people wanted to go. And as people came to live in the towns, they came to want to go to these, and no longer was this area just for the daimyo. It became a place where you'd go and congregate, like the theater district. And it had theater, it had, as we said, kabuki, it had music, it had restaurants, it had a lot of glamorous women, and then you wanted to go there and show off your clothes. So there were stores came, and it was see and be seen, and there were fabulous dresses or the kimonos that people would wear. And so the whole idea of this pleasure center was something that became ingrained in town life over this whole period of the Tokugawas. And this whole area was called ukiyo-e. And you pronounced it, my Japanese language person here can say it in Japanese. Ukiyo-e. Ukiyo-e is an Americanized pronunciation. But sometimes you'll hear the woodblock plinths referred to as ukiyo-e because they became so popular and so prolific in this period of these districts growing up. And the Japanese thought of them as everyday things. It was something that you'd pick up like a flyer or a handbill, and that was very important to you because you could see what was going on in the ukiyo-e district. Ukiyo-e translates literally as floating world. So you may have heard that term, floating world, and that's what it stood for. This was the world of theater and dance and eating and entertainment. So the publishers who were working, oh, here's another one. This is a restaurant. I thought this was great because she's feeding sushi to her son in 1844. So as I said, these woodblock plinths had been around for a long time, and it was a publisher would work with an artist, and the artist would do the design. A woodcutter would carve the block out of a soft wood, and then the printer would ink it, and then it would be produced and then distributed. And the publishers were sort of like the entrepreneurs around putting this whole team together, although the artist had a big say too, and they worked with some of the same people over and over again. Carving a woodblock was very difficult to do it right. It's said that it took 10 years for someone to become a very fine woodblock print carver. So what the publishers started to do was saying, well, I don't have to restrict my publishing empire to just advertising these events. Why don't I create a whole book of prints and then sell that at bookstores? Because people like these prints so much that we could probably make a lot of money if we sold big collections of woodblock prints. And that's how the whole pinnacle of woodblock printmaking got to be, because the publishers started doing series. So this one, for instance, is Station 46 from the 53 stations of the Tokaido Road by Hiroshige, and you would actually buy the whole collection. So many of the woodblock prints that you see today might be actually tear sheets from some of these collections. Actually finding a whole book together like this is quite rare. So this goes on, and here's one. Kunisada was very famous for his fierce-looking portrayal of actors, very colorful, lots of sort of tattoos on the actors that he put in great detail. Here's another one by Tudisada, 32 physiognomical types in the modern world. And this type was the in-demand type. So I've often looked at it and say, what's so special about her that she's in demand? And I think it's because she's got this whole book of love letters here and more of them tucked under her arm. So that's something else. And then here's one, The Mansion of the Plates. This is ghost stories. The whole book of ghost stories that Hokusai did sold very, very well. Thousands of them. The Mansion of the Plates is an old Japanese tale. It's about a rich landowner, and he has a housekeeper who breaks a very valuable dish. And he gets so mad at her that he kills her and throws her in a well. And she becomes a ghost rising out of the well on her plates to forever after haunt her master. But this is the kind of things that someone would buy a whole book of these. And it would be many different Japanese tales that the Japanese would be familiar with. This one is very special. This is from the series of 6 Poetic Immortals. This is a warrior. This particular print is a surimono. Surimono is a unique or special genre of Japanese printmaking. And it's made in fewer printing runs, than the regular Japanese woodblock print. And what the artist would do was, after it was printed, the artist could go in and embellish with gold or do an embossing so it had texture to it. And if you see a surimono in a museum, it's really good to have a little magnifying glass, because you can look at the magnifying glass and you can see the mica that the artist might have used, and the gold leaf and the embossing. So it's a very rich, beautiful, very highly specialized talent. And it was used by clubs, like our book club. You want to create one, Diane? It was used by clubs to give presents to each other on New Year, Japanese New Year. So it was you would commission an artist to do it, and then you would give it to your friends, and it was very, very special. So they always look to see if there is surimono in any collection that you might be looking at. And then here's one of the most famous collections ever. This is the 36 Views of Mount Fuji by Hokusai. This was the pinnacle of Hokusai's career. Hokusai was a very gifted artist. He taught other artists how to paint. He was gifted in calligraphy. He was also quite a character. He was very dramatic. And just to get attention, he would sometimes go into a street, take a big, huge paintbrush, and one day say, I'm going to paint a picture, and paint it on the sidewalk. I mean, he was a character. But he was prolific, and he did beautiful things. He also tried out new techniques. And in this instance, he had just learned about Prussian blue. It was a new way to create a blue ink. And so he used it quite a bit. And you can see, like, right here is blue and this blue, and he just really wanted to show off that he had mastered the technique of Prussian blue. So this great wave of Kanagawa, which is a familiar symbol, I want to point something out here. Most people don't see that there's a little boat here. And what this is all about is there's a fishing fleet that has to cross a body of water to get from one end of an island to the port where the fishing market is. And that can be very, very choppy. And so Hokusai was capturing that these fishermen sometimes have to face a dangerous crossing of the waters to sell their catch. And of course, over the years, it's been interpreted as many, many other things, because it's such an overwhelming picture. So much to look at. And this is 36 views, so here's Mount Fuji, and you can pick out Mount Fuji. Here's Mount Fuji at the summit, little Mount Fuji here, Mount Fuji here. So that was just an extreme example of how beautiful these prints could be. So now something happens. Tokugawa clan is defeated in a revolutionary war, and the Meiji clan comes into power in Japan. And that's the Meiji Revolution, followed by the Meiji Restoration. Rule was returned to the emperor from the shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty. And Meijis were absolutely convinced that being shut off from the West was a huge mistake. And they wanted to industrialize and learn about the West as quickly as possible. And I mean like overnight. Like in, 5 years, they were sending delegations to the Americas, to France, to Germany, to England. They were studying forms of government. They were studying education systems. They were studying food. They were studying dress. And then they'd meet people who they thought were leaders in their countries and invite them back to Japan to teach the Japanese how to do all these things that they had been cut off from. And here's a picture of 1883, and you can see that some of the people are in Western dress and some of the people are in Japanese dress, and this was kind of a blending of what was happening. And remember, this time in 1883, this was the Industrial Revolution in Europe and in the Americas. So what happened was all these Japanese things that nobody in Europe had ever seen and all the Western things that nobody in Japan had ever seen were now trading back and forth. But in Europe and in the Americas, particularly Paris, Boston, New York, there was a craze for Japanese goods. It was a mania. It was called a mania, actually, if you read the letters of the times. And people were buying them for their homes, and they were buying them for their clothes, and they were buying them for their hanging paintings on the wall. And this is by Tissot, who is a French painter, young ladies looking at Japanese objects. This is a big painting, too. And this is some kind of a boat that they're looking at. And one of the things people loved was the craftsmanship. They had never thought that individual objects like this could be crafted so beautifully. And since it was the Industrial Revolution, what was happening in the Americas and in Europe was that things were becoming more uniform. The artful hand was being lost, the individuality was being lost, and people were just agog that in Japan you could still do this wonderful individual craft work, while the thought was in the industrialized societies it was really very sloppy and not well put together. So that was later. Who said that? That was after World War II. So here's a picture of Monet's wife, Madame Monet, Camille Monet, La Japonaise. And Monet, this is one of the only full-length portraits of anyone that Monet ever did. And he did this of his wife. It's a spoof. She's really had dark hair. She put on a wig. She dressed in this sort of fanciful kimono. And then they put these crazy fans in the background. And if you notice, her fan is the French tricolor. So, and then you have this Japanese woman over here looking at her. Who the heck are you over there? So artists were influenced. They were influenced by what they saw. And so influenced that if you look at the side-by-side, look at this. This is a Monet. This is a Japanese woodblock print. They're walking home from the station in the snow with their umbrellas. They're walking home from the station in the snow with their umbrellas. They were very, very influenced. They had never seen art like this before. They hadn't seen art that was so colorful. They hadn't seen art that was so with the composition like this, with the winding rows. They had never seen things with so much nature in them. And here's another one. This is in the museum. This is Jean Lafarge, who also spent time in Japan. And this is stained glass that people were buying up for their homes. They had never seen stained glass so colorful, and Lafarge picked up a lot of this color and decoration from what he saw in Japan. So this brings us to how did all this get to the Museum of Fine Arts? And the whole story about the eccentrics. And I'll pause just a minute and take a drink of water, because as I said, I did a presentation this morning too. So not this one, another one. So these guys were some of them were rich, some of them were academics, some of them were Chinese and Japanese lovers and wanted to see what was going on. So there's a whole backstory here. This was taken in Japan of these guys. They wanted Japan to be like this. They had heard about Japan. They didn't know what it was like, but they wanted it to be like this. They were concerned that they would miss this, and Japan would become like that. This is 1930s Japan. This is a woodblock print. This is how quickly Japan changed. So, Edward Morse, he was from Portland, Maine. He also lived in Salem, Massachusetts. He was a terrible student. He used to carve on his desk. He was a great, he was a great sketcher and artist, and he used to like to play in the shells in Portland, Maine. That was the only thing that kept his attention. So he had a teacher, how influential teachers are. He had a teacher who said to him, well, why don't you study mollusks? And he started to study mollusks, and he started to categorize them. He's very influenced by Darwin. And he used to go to Damariscotta. You can still go here. This is a shell midden. If you haven't seen one of these before, we have some of these in Wayland by the Sudbury River. Maybe not as old as this one, but it's like a landfill. It's where you throw your shells if you've eaten an oyster and you throw the shell there. Where maybe you throw your bones, you throw your old tools, you throw if you're a potter, you throw your fragments of pottery in there. And if you're an archaeologist, you start at the bottom and you go through layer by layer by layer to see how people lived during these times. And Sylvester Morse studied shell middens. Then he heard that his favorite thing that he studied were worms, marine worms, brachiopods. And he was told, if you go to Japan, there are brachiopods there. And you'll see brachiopods that you could never see in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Maine. So he goes to, I'm ahead of myself here, he goes to Japan, and this is what happens. He lands in Yokohama. He takes a train from Yokohama to Tokyo. He looks out the train window, and he sees a shell midden. And he says, I got to go back there. As soon as he gets to Tokyo, organizes an expedition, goes back, starts to excavate, finds shards of pottery. Has never seen pottery like this ever. So beautiful glazes, beautiful shapes. And he starts to collect pottery, and he collects 500 pieces of pottery, of Japanese pottery. He'd never seen anything like it. So he comes back to Boston, and he starts giving lectures. And this is how shell middens are related to this whole story. He comes back to Boston, and he starts giving lectures. And he had an eye for detail like no one had. He used to talk about the shoes people wore, whether they had one piece of wood on the bottom or two pieces of wood on the bottom. He talked about household goods. He talked about homes and how they were built. He was so impressed with the simplicity of Japanese homes. And he had a big, big audience. And people heard from Morse what Japan was like, and he encouraged other people to come, and he arranged more expeditions. So then we have William Sturgis Bigelow. Bigelow gave one of the largest collections of Japanese prints to the museum. And he wouldn't really have been encouraged to go to Japan if it wasn't for Morse, nor would many other adventurers of the time. Bigelow's story is also very interesting. His father was a famous surgeon on MGH, 1880s, 1890s, and he wanted his son to be a surgeon. He did study to be a doctor, but he didn't like it. He gave it up. Encouraged by Morse, he went to Japan for 7 years. He even converted to Buddhism. His father was furious, askance, awful. Why is my son? He should be a surgeon. You know, he's in Japan studying Buddhism. And while Bigelow was there, Bigelow is from a wealthy family, really wealthy family. He starts buying, and he buys everything. He buys thousands of prints. He buys paintings. He buys armor. He buys pottery. He buys tools. I mean, and with the intention that he was going to bring it back to Boston and give it all to the Museum of Fine Arts. So he was really, really important to the museum because he gave such a huge collection to the museum. And the museum started to display it right away. Back in the 1890s or so, they were already displaying Japanese art. So then we have a few other people that you may have heard of. Ernest Fenollosa was also one of these people. He was from Salem, Mass. He studied Japanese painting and collected Japanese painting. We have Okakura Kakuso. He came from Japan to Boston to work at the Museum of Fine Arts, but he had a very captivating personality, and he captured the attention of Isabella Stewart Gardner. And at her palace on the Fenway, she would give Japanese tea ceremonies under the tutelage of Kakuso, and he wrote a book called The Book of Tea, which is still in circulation today and still quite popular if you're studying the tea ceremony. But all of this is to say that this whole milieu of going back and forth between Boston and Tokyo, or Boston and Japan, they went back and forth, some of them several times. It became the thing to do. And wealthy people wanted to go to Japan, and you really couldn't, really had to go to Japan if you wanted to be in the upper echelons of Boston society. It was a very, it was that kind of a society. It was important. You had to go to Japan. Charles Spalding was one of the people, him and his brother, they went to Japan, and the Spaldings collected tons of stuff. And they also collected thousands of woodblock prints, thousands and thousands of them. But they didn't collect them the way Bigelow did. They were a little later, they were in the 1920s. They actually bought other people's collections. If they knew there was a collection in Paris, they sent their dealer out to go buy it. If they knew somebody in the Americas had collected something, they went out and they bought it. And then they gave everything to the MFA, with one very interesting caveat. Nothing they gave to the MFA could be shown in public. And the reason for this is they were very aware that Japanese prints fade quickly when exposed to light, and they lose their color. And so this was the stipulation. So for years and years, this 100 years that we had the bales, none of them were ever shown in a gallery. And so by digitizing the collection, you can now see it on your computers. And this is the URL right here. And I have some handouts in the back that has it on it if you want to go home and look at it. And I think it was kind of a surprise to people that when you looked at it through your computer, you could turn on your magnifier and you could see the detail of the print, which you normally couldn't see in a museum exhibit. And it opened up this whole new world of examining how the prints were made and thinking about how the prints were made. So it was another outcome of this project that I was working on. Japanese prints today are still made. There was a sort of a time between like 1920 and maybe 1950s that they kind of were in a lull. But then today's Japanese artists who were interested in printmaking started to pick up on it again, only they do it differently. They have much wider artistic license. So instead of depending on a team where there's a woodblock carver and the artist, the carver, the inker, the publisher, many of the artists today do all of those steps themselves. Or they'll do 3 of the steps and they'll work with somebody else. But they have great artistic license. So this is from 1960. They're not confined to the traditional way that Hokusai did prints. This is Yumataro from 1954. He does a lot of what he calls mountain men. He has also done prints, a lot of religious symbols. And this is one of my favorites, Reiki Iwami. This is a woman. She's been doing prints most of her life like this, and she's still alive. She's in her 90s. And she's a very modern approach to printmaking. Now, this brings us to Toulouse-Lautrec. This is the current exhibit at the museum, the Toulouse-Lautrec posters. Toulouse-Lautrec was definitely influenced by Japanese prints. And we have an exhibit right now in the Gun Gallery. And you will go, I hope you go. It's really a fun exhibit. The prints are vivid and fun to look at. It relates it to Lautrec, and when it says the stars of Paris, all of the actors and actresses, mostly actresses who frequented the same nightclubs that he did, and he would do their publicity for them. But you will see on the walls, they'll have some of the Toulouse-Lautrec posters, and then they'll have little photographs of Japanese prints underneath them showing how Lautrec had been so influenced by what he saw in these Japanese prints in Paris, where Japanomania was rampant. And what presentation the museum wouldn't conclude unless you ended in the exit through the gift shop. So you can buy these. You can buy these prints. Uniqlo sells them. They have an agreement with the Museum of Fine Arts, and you can buy yourself your own Kanagana wave. So I was happy to take questions. That's a summary of where these prints are and how we got them and what we're doing with them today. Thanks.
What is the range of sizes of the prints? Are they from very small to very large? Or are they typically...
You know, that's an interesting question because there are different names for different sizes. Most of them are not small. Most of them are about more like this, or if they're like this. And there's a different Japanese name for this one, and there's a name for this one. Some of them are triptychs like this, but they're not tiny. And very few would be as small as this. They're more like that. Yeah. Yes?
How did you go about cataloging when you first started?
Well, there's a system called the museum system, which lots of museums use to enter objects into their acquisition system. And that, like many applications, of course, this was, now 10 years ago. I'm sure that it's improved, like many applications have. You get a template in front of you, and you fill it in, and it asks you things like, am I answering your question? It asks you, as you sit at a computer, it asks you who is the artist, when was it done, what size is it, what color is it, what words would you use to catalog it, and we had a controlled vocabulary that we used. That's sort of it in a nutshell. Yes, please.
Can you describe a little bit the process of taking a piece of wood that gets carved, and then the ink gets applied, but it looks like there has to be a fair amount of handwork, more than just sort of putting something down and running over it with a thing. It looks like it would take a lot of careful artistry to get that kind of ink coloration and the detail out of a block of wood.
Yeah, that's a really good and important question. The way this is done is that you create a key block, which is your block with the black outline. And then for every color, you carve a different block. And so you might have up to 12 blocks for one print. The key block acts as your reference point and actually has little notches in it for you to line it up with the other blocks and eventually with the paper. And then the printer inks the different blocks, the different colors, and uses a paper called, it's actually mulberry paper mostly, and then rolls the paper over the different colored blocks. So you're quite right, it takes a great deal of precision. It also takes a lot of thought on the part of the artist and the wood carver about how they're going to do this to make this all come out right, which was why these colorful ones were so fantastic, that you could have such a beautiful end product from using 12 carved wooden blocks or something like that. So, and it was something else that was so of interest to the early collectors because the Japanese thought of them as sort of everyday things that they saw in the floating world. They didn't think of them that these were necessarily these high works of art, you know, and other people who saw the process really thought that this is really quite complicated and spectacular.
Are there any wood blocks in the collection?
There are wood blocks in the collection. Occasionally, yes, we do definitely have them, and we do show them sometimes, like in a case in the middle of the floor with the wood blocks around the gallery. I think I have a picture here. That's me. Oh, this is very funny if you want to see something. This is me giving a tour. This is a tour guide we had in Italy a couple of years in Venice. I got a real kick out of that. The universal uniform of docents. But this would be a piece of wood. And here are some of the tools. Well, here first you do the design in pencil. Here are some of the tools. So you'd carve, this is just one block. You'd carve one block, you'd put the paper over it, you'd roll it like that. That's a very beginner's set. Yeah.
Because wood eventually warps, changes shape, when you buy woodblock prints, they're always numbered. And it could be 40 out of 100. As the numbers go up, I would suspect that the wood itself becomes different, I'm not sure. Does the print lose value after a certain number? Do you know what the number is?
Yeah, I actually, a little bit about it. That's a very good question. I wouldn't say necessarily the print loses value. Some people actually prefer a print that's a little more subtle and shaded, about collectors now, than the first printings, which are very bold colors, like the one of the Mansion of the Plates, which was very bold color print, and then the second one I showed of the daimios was a very subtle print. A lot of the paper, a lot of the color had faded away. But it's about 200 prints from a block, and the blocks get very they're inked, and then as you put the paper on them, one sheet after another, it does fade toward the end of the, let's say it's a 200 run, and get lighter and lighter and lighter. So it is up to all of these things with value, of what things are valued. It's in the eye of the beholder. But I would say generally people like the brightly colored ones, and particularly what they look for is ones that aren't torn, soiled, because these were handed out in the streets, and to find them in pristine condition is really a challenge. That's the big challenge, yeah.
So, I know nothing about the process, so, they didn't reapply the color in between?
I can't answer that for certain, because I think that some of the publishers and printers probably had their own techniques. So maybe some of them did. So and maybe it depended on what they were printing. So I can't answer that for sure. And I particularly can't answer that with the contemporary prints, because the artists can do so many individual things with it. So I think it depends on the publisher working with the designers to really decide how they want that to happen. What would be my guess?
Thank you. So I have one more question. In the timeline of woodblock in different cultures, what came before the Japanese art? And I mean, were there other cultures that influenced them besides the French, but that was later? So
The Chinese, it's thought that the Chinese invented woodblock printmaking, and a lot of it maybe had to do with language, because they wanted to print something, announcements, and it was hard. That was one way to do it. So the Chinese thought. When it went to Japan, it became more decorative, more really than what I've seen of early Chinese prints, but I'm not really sure. I don't know if that's getting to answer your question. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that triggered a thought that since the alphabet is so complex, the kanji alphabet is so complex, they really never developed a movable type in the way that the press, where it became, printing became an easy thing to produce.
Yeah, that was
Sort of a piece at a time.
during the Meiji Restoration. They got closer and closer to having more movable type, so that it was a gradual process. But they did finally figure it out. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not entirely clear what the purpose of the prints was in the first place. So were they a kind of advertising poster that was handed out? It wasn't applied to walls, or were they for advertising to bring people to the venues of the floating world?
Well, very early, yes, that's what happened with the early floating world. But then they very quickly became decorative. People might stick them on their wall. Yeah. So it evolved. It was over several hundred years. So they evolved from being utilitarian. Actually, the first ones, the very, very earliest Japanese woodblock prints were mostly erotic art. And you will see a lot of, if you go to exhibits of Japanese woodblock prints, and their early ones from the 1600s, early 1700s, it's a lot of erotica. But that's how the internet started, too.
Erotic art. So
Yeah.
It was actually quite early rather than later on. What was the point of that? I mean, was that also advertising?
Yeah, advertising, having a book of erotica. I don't think the Japanese were the first.
It's quite blatant.
Graphic,
Yeah, graphic.
very graphic, literally very graphic. Yeah. I think it was just a part of the culture. Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand. Did the artist work on a piece of paper first?
Yeah,
It was all separated?
they drew a design
They
first.
drew a design and colored that design so that somebody knew what to do in terms of what the final product was going to look like?
Yes.
And how was that transferred to the block in terms of, was that piece of art destroyed as it's written, or?
No, you would put the piece of paper over this, and you would carve it, and then maybe it would get destroyed. I don't know, really, but we would carve it based on the design, and you might have a design for each piece of wood that's going to be a different block.
The carver was
Very skilled, very, very skilled. The carver was as I said, 10 years to really be an expert woodblock print carver. That's easily.
Well, that would just not be carving. That would be keeping 10 blocks in your mind.
Right. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. Yeah. So
process.
very, very complicated. Mm-hmm.
I saw those the designs are so intricate.
Yeah.
With the color.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very intricate. Very intricate. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. What?
If anyone's interested in knowing about, one of the Boston collectors at the Boston College, Museum, the Mullen Museum of Art, there's an exhibit now called Egomania, Collecting Japanese Art in the Gilded Age.
Oh, that's great.
Lars and Isabel Anderson were a very wealthy Boston couple who were caught
Let me
up
just show
in
you.
that Japan craze.
That I was just gonna. Sorry.
Their collections are
Sorry.
there, and also some other Japanese art, and we have a newly restored eagle,
Oh, that's the one I want.
a Meiji period, a larger than life-size bronze eagle that was discovered. So, just thought.
This just happened to be a slide that I had. Thank you for saying that so much, Norma. I have to come over and see that. This is sort of like what a block would look like, a simple, just the outline. Carving. Yeah. She's looking in a mirror.
Is that a current one?
No, this is a hobbyist did this. I pulled this off the web. No, it's not. Yeah. Let's have it. Yeah. Okay.
To see that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
I can't believe you did one this morning, too.
No, I had to give a something else.
This is great.